Okay, everyone, welcome. We are distributing some learning materials, and as we do, I'd like to just key you into a few things going on. Many of us, about 60 members of Temple, just came back, including a few that are here, just came back from the APAC Policy Conference, and Rabbi Loss as well, in Washington, D.C., and I must say it was quite a heady time to be in Washington. Watching Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech in the Senate offices of our Democratic senators was really quite an experience. We sat there. No matter what you feel about the politics of it, I will tell you it was a sort of an overwhelming feeling until Debbie Stabenow came in, and I can only just tell you that she wasn't quite as enamored with the speech as we were. Just to give you a little hint of how things went for the rest of the afternoon, but. That's not really the topic of today, although maybe Professor Walzer will get into that. As you know, we've had a lot of luck with these college-based, university-based lectures. Up to now, they've been University of Michigan, and in the interest of bipartisanship, this year we are lucky enough to learn with professors from the Michigan State University and also Wayne State as well. Some of you are leaving in April with Rabbi Loss, myself, to go to Israel. If you are, after the lecture and discussion, if you could stay right here. If you would like to go out into the atrium, and Professor Walzer has graciously agreed to stay back a little bit and answer your questions in a more informal, one-on-one type of thing. And we have a little bit of food and water out there for you as well. There is really only one more very important announcement. We hope you enjoy this lecture. We hope you enjoy the series, but most importantly, we hope you will take one of these sheets home with you and vote for ARTSA, the Reform Zionist Movement in the World Zionist Organization elections. April is the deadline is sometime in April, and I must tell you that if we as a Reform movement can capture 51% of the seats in the World Zionist Organization, good things will happen. Reform Jewish rights in Israel will begin to become realized. Women's rights. There will be even things like ecology. It is extremely important that we essentially win this election. There are elections going on in Israel, I know, and they're important, but these elections right here in America are almost as important for the future of the Israeli state. I really hope it's $10 to vote. That's just to cover the costs of the vote. So vote early and vote often. And I just have to announce that if you do vote, and we will be sending you a form, and if you fill out the form, it's a raffle ticket, and the winner of the raffle will get a reserved parking spot at the High Holy Days at Temple Israel. So vote as often as you possibly can, and for all of your friends, I think that's a prize worth working for. I just thank you to our introducer. With the help of a very generous family, we were able to set this series up. They hate it when I give them credit, but the Jackier family really put this into effect. But it is our educational director, Rabbi Ariana Gordon, who has put it together, and I'd like to bring her up now. Thank you, Ariana.
Thank you. I'm so glad to see such a nice turnout tonight. I've been hearing for years from our Michigan State students what a wonderful professor Ken Walzer is, and we've been trying to figure out a way to get him here for a number of years. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Professor Walzer is a professor of history in the James Madison College at MSU and has been the director of Jewish Studies since 2004. In recent years, he has won the State of Michigan Teaching Excellence Award, the Mid-Michigan Alumni Club Quality and Undergraduate Teaching Award, and the Outstanding Study Abroad Director Award in Arts and Letters. He was formerly the Associate Dean and the Interim Dean of the James Madison College, and he directed the Center for Integrative Studies in Arts and Humanities. Professor Walzer's interests cover American social and political history, especially in urban and immigration history, and also modern Jewish history in Europe, America, and Israel. So tonight, clearly, we're going to focus on Israel, and we are all so excited to learn from you. Thank you for being here.
Does everybody have the one-page handout outline? That may help you follow me along. You can write on it, just can't make a paper airplane out of it. I want to thank Rabbi Gordon and Lisa Kaplan for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have met Paul Gedwab tonight, and I know Rabbi Loss, and I'm pleased that you're both here. And I want to thank all of you for coming to participate in this interesting adult education series. Tonight's the kickoff. I don't know exactly what my colleagues are going to do in the subsequent events, but my job is to talk with you about what is distinctive about Israel, and to do so from the perspective of a historian. What is distinctive about this place we call Israel? What is distinctive about its history? What is distinctive about it as a nation state and society? I also hope, if we have time, to point out a few things that may be less than distinctive about Israel, but are also important that we know. I plan to leave time for questions, interchange, and mutual learning to follow. I'll try and talk no further than 5 to 8 or 8. Even if I have to cut off and leave at least a half hour for questions and discussion, and then we'll have more time outside if people like to follow up. My bona fides for talking about Israel include my participation in the Brandeis University faculty seminar on Israel Studies 10 years ago in summer 2005. That's an effort by Brandeis to help train more faculty in American higher education to be prepared to teach about Israel. That initiative has produced over 200 new faculty teaching about Israel on American campuses, where once it was neglected, now it is not. And I also have bona fides from my work building and leading and also teaching in MSU's Jewish Studies summer program at Hebrew University in Israel. I negotiated that program in '96, led it in '98 and 2000, and after a multi-year suspension by the university during the Second Intifada, I went back in 2006 and had to come out under the rockets from Lebanon. I've been to Israel 8 times since '96. I recently negotiated MSU's new spring semester program at Hebrew University in 2011. And 2 years ago, I lectured at Haifa University and at Ghetto Fighters House. Related to my Holocaust work, that's the primary scholarship I'm doing now, I have also been responsible for 2 individuals being named as righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, and I take particular pride in that. I should tell you that leading students on study abroad impacts not only the students, but faculty like us who lead. I was trained, so that you get a sense of who's talking to you, I was trained as an American immigration and urban historian at Harvard University, working with Oscar Handlin, the Dean of American Immigration Historians. That was before I came to Michigan State University for a 1-year position. It's 43 years later. My wife thought she needed to corner the market on vacuum cleaner bags because I was taking her to the frontier, and you couldn't possibly get vacuum cleaner bags here. Because of my training, I therefore looked at modern Jewish history mainly along a Europe-America axis. I am a grandchild of the mass Jewish immigration that came through Ellis Island around the turn of the 20th century. My grandfather came in 1902. And I have been preoccupied in my work in searching the worlds of my grandparents and my parents, exploring the communities they created and the problems they tackled. Going to and teaching in Israel helped me to discover a more complex triangle of modern Jewish history, adding the Israel axis. And it really transformed me. What was once central in Jewish history, I began to realize, Europe, amidst momentous events, became peripheral during the 20th century. What were peripheral at the start of the century, North America and Palestine/Israel, became, in this century, the two centers of modern Jewish life. It's around that formula that we built Jewish studies at Michigan State University, and it's around that formula that I now consider myself a student of modern Jewish history, meaning I seek to know all sides of the triangle and to study both major centers of modern Jewish life. Let me begin by saying in this lecture on what is distinctive about Israel and Israel's history, let me begin by saying that our traditional way of looking at and understanding Israel is a religious influence one, emphasizing the framework of exile and return. I'm sure we're all familiar with that framework. Israel is the Jewish homeland where once Jews lived concentrated in the land of Israel in antiquity, and then were expelled and for 2 millennia were in exile, living first widely through the Mediterranean basin, and then subsequently in Europe, and late during early modernity, primarily in Eastern Europe. During the 20th century, Jews reconcentrated in the land of Israel and declared and built and successfully fought for and defended Jewish statehood. This is a story then, and all of us know this, about the reconstitution of the center of Jewish life and the coming out of Galut, the ingathering of the exiles in the center. It is also a story about the return of Jews to sovereignty and to political life, the return to what historians call agency, being able to act in the world, with the unbelievable creation and defense of an independent state with its own government and armed forces. But this is not exactly the way that I look at it. And so, first off, in exploring what is distinctive about Israel and its history, I want to tell you how I think about it. Normally, we think of homelands as the functioning centers of large national communities, the places from which some nationals depart, and by their cumulative journeys outward, they create national diasporas. We're all familiar with this. China is the center of Chinese life. It is the national community of the Chinese. And from China, there has been created over time a widespread overseas Chinese diaspora. We see that now at Michigan State. We have 1,200 Chinese students all of a sudden who are paying full tuition. I wonder how that happened. India is the center of Indian life. And from India has been created a large and growing Indian diaspora. Israel is not and has not been that kind of homeland. If you think about it, Israel is a distinctive homeland in that it was created out of the actions of Jewish nationals who were already spread for millennia in the international Jewish diaspora. Instead of the national homeland creating a diaspora dynamic, we had an international diaspora creating a national homeland. That's unique. We haven't seen that anywhere else yet. So Israel is a distinctive kind of homeland, different from others. Now today, ironically, Israel, that homeland, is becoming the first and largest center of Jewish life in the globe, surpassing American Jewry in numbers. And today, under the pressures and dangers and the concrete limitations of Israeli life, there's only so much space, there's only so much opportunity, and there's only so much peace available. Israel is now fast generating a diaspora of overseas Israelis. We don't know the exact number, but the numbers are surprisingly high. And we see Israelis living in the American Jewish community everywhere. But the first thing to note in mapping what is distinctive about Israel and Israeli history is that it's a homeland created by nationals already spread in the international Jewish diaspora and not a more familiar homeland like most others. That's a picture of the third Aliyah in the early 1920s. And those are newcomers from the diaspora who have come to Israel to begin to labor with their hands and their shoulders to build a new Jewish national state and society. Okay? Mostly I continue to do work in Eastern Europe, and I work often with Yitzka books, memory books about the communities that were destroyed. This is a picture from a Yitzka book, Sefer Neshvish, a community, Nizovich, and this was a picture sent back by pioneers who'd gone to Israel from the diaspora to build a new society in the 1920s, and they were in the Moshav Rehovot. Right? Most people who go to Israel will know where Rehovot is, just south of Tel Aviv. Now, the second thing to note in mapping what is or may be distinctive about Israel is that it is, since it was created out of the diaspora, it's an immigrant nation. That's what's fundamental and distinctive about Israel. It's a nation formed out of the processes of voluntary and involuntary migration, what Israelis call aliyah, or plural aliyot, but what we immigration historians recognize is a process that happens all over the globe. In this, Israel is in fact like a number of other societies. It's like America, and it's like many other new societies and states, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Argentina, who've all been created by the processes of international migration. But it is distinctive, and unlike many other nation states that have been built on core national societies, or what in time came to be core national societies, like England, France, Germany, Holland, or Austria. It's a different kind of nation than those nations, because those nations for many years resisted being immigrant nations and accepting immigrants. Now they have them, and they're trying to deal with the challenges that poses. But Israel was created out of immigration. Ari Shavit, the Israeli writer, who many of you may know his name, was recently at Michigan State University, and at one point in a seminar, which I was participating with him, he blurted out that American Jews and Israelis are very much alike in one respect. And I leaned in to listen to him. What nugget am I going to hear? And what came from Ari was, we are all boat people. And I think there's truth in that. We came as voluntary immigrants or as refugees from somewhere else, and then in the arriving had to become something else, either Americans in America or Israelis in Israel. So Israel is distinctively an immigration nation that has repeatedly brought people in from elsewhere, and despite the differences, tried to make them over into Israelis. Jewish immigrants to America and to Israel also came in multiple waves at different times from different places. It's really quite remarkable when you see the statistics and the patterns. The Jewish community we created in the United States and the nation state and society that Israelis created in Eretz Israel had repeatedly to confront the challenges of digesting large new waves of newcomers, absorbing, acculturating, and assimilating people who were in important respects, although they were all Jews, unalike and different. In Israel, the founding fathers and mothers were products of multiple aliyot during the early 20th century, culminating in what we call the fifth aliyot, wave of German Jewish refugees in the 1930s. They had to form an Israeli Hebrew-speaking people in the Yishuv, the community before statehood. And they, in turn, then almost immediately after they declared and defended statehood, had to rise to the immense challenges of absorbing successive additional waves of newcomers from Europe after the war, survivors from the camps and returnees from the forests and from hiding. And then shortly after that, they had to absorb even more migrants and refugees from the Maghreb in North America and from the Arab nations of the Middle East during the post-colonial revolutions that followed after the war in the 50s and 60s. Think about that. Immigrants hardly here long enough, or hardly there long enough, who then had to respond to the challenge of absorbing yet again new waves of immigrants. More recently, there have been still new waves of immigrants to Israel. You'll see them if you're going on the mission. Israel is one of the most diverse places on this earth. And these waves have come from Russia and Ukraine after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and they have come from Ethiopia. Think of the differences between the immigrants that created Israel, the immigrants that came in the 50s and 60s, the immigrants that came in the Russian wave, and then the immigrants that came from Ethiopia. Different languages, different historical experiences, different levels of economic development, different possibilities in terms of making it in whatever opportunities exist. This has been a challenge to Israel, and Israel has been dealing with this challenge since the beginning. And perhaps now we're on the cusp of yet another wave from France. We don't know. But we're watching. So to repeat, Israel is a distinctive homeland that has been built out of diaspora. And second, those who have been returning home, when we think about returning home as going back to some place that's familiar. Those who have been returning home have had to adjust to a new place, a dominant national culture. They had to become conversant in its new language. They had to adjust and become something new and speak something new. Over time, the coming of so many newcomers in so many waves has been a challenge to the host state and society. As the late Barry Rubin observed on the first page of his interesting book, Understanding Israel, published 2 years ago, differences between secular and religious Jews, multiple languages, differences in levels of economic development within the population, and differing historical experience of its new citizens before coming to Israel made the Israel nation-building process extremely complex and challenging. And that's still the case. It's an immigrant nation, and the story goes on. Multiple waves of immigrants. Some of you may know that I'm writing a book about Buchenwald, about the rescue of children and youths at Buchenwald. 173 of those 1,000 boys who were found when Patton's army pitched up at Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, in July 1945, were on a boat to Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, and they were the first Holocaust survivors to arrive in Palestine after the war. And you can see them on the lower right of that picture, holding the Israeli flag. The other pictures are pictures of the illegal immigration to Palestine during the British Mandate. People had to fight their way past the British to get to the United States. I found another Buchenwald boy this week and found out he was 2 years in a prison on Cyprus for trying to break the British blockade. And the colored picture at the bottom, the beautiful woman in it, is the Ethiopian immigration of recent years. So Israel is still an immigrant nation. Yet a third thing to note in exploring what is distinctive about Israel and about Israeli history is that immigration to Israel has been shaped more by an ideological vision than immigration has elsewhere. It has mostly and certainly historically been informed by an idea about Jewish nationhood. Right? This is the central idea in the formation of Israel, the Zionist idea. And it's been shaped by the Zionist movement, who prepared many of these immigrants to go to Palestine by putting them on training farms in Europe before they arrived, so that they could become effective workers in the building up of a new nation. It's a much more ideological story than the story of immigration to America is. And I want to spend a little time on that and dwell on that a little bit, because I suspect that most of us, certainly I, are products of the American Jewish immigration, right? And where it's been less ideological. Over time, the Zionist idea as a motive force in immigration has become less pronounced in the Israeli story. Many of the Russians are simply fleeing Russia and are not necessarily imbued with the Zionist idea. Many of the Ethiopians have a very traditional view of the world and are not, in that sense, Zionists. But in the beginning, the Zionist idea created the framework and the rules and the expectations to which others would later need to adjust as newcomers. Because the people who built early Israel, the Yishuv before statehood, were committed Zionists. And by that I mean they were people with a mission, and they were part of a global movement, and they believed in a specific answer to the Jewish question. The Jewish question in modernity was, how were Jews to live in the modern world? Were they to live as the nationals of the nations in which they already found themselves? Or were they to create a new nation where they could be nationals of their own nation? Or were they to look to God to provide direction and salvation? There were many choices in the Jewish communities before the Holocaust. And in fact, because the Jewish immigrants were, the Jewish people in Europe were so removed from real politics that they had a very heady form of ideological politics. There were communists, there were socialists, there were Bundists, there were Zionists, and if that wasn't enough, you could be a socialist Zionist or a visionist Zionist or a religious Zionist, and people argued all the time, what is the Jewish future? And they argued heavily. Big surprise. And they argued about what was the language of the future. Is it Yiddish or is it Hebrew? And where is the future? It's here? Is it there? These are the arguments that people in the 20s and 30s grew up with. The people who came to Palestine before the 30s especially in the 20s at the third Aliyah, which was the most ideological wave of all, they came with a specific vision to build basically a socialist Zionist state in the homeland. And the state that won independence in 1948 pretty much was shaped by their aspirations. Now, most Jews, our forebears who came to the United States, by contrast, were shaped by a liberal idea, not a Zionist idea, even though they might support Zionists while being liberal American Jews here, as many of us do. They came with an idea to be free and equal citizens in a society of equal or potentially equal opportunities. They came like my grandparents, fleeing constricted shtetl life and hardships. My grandparents were from Eastern Galicia. And they came seeking to make new and more abundant lives in the Golden Land, the Golden and Medina. That's why they came here. And while they probably could not have fully articulated the liberal idea that animated them, causing them to move as soon as the railroad connections made it possible, they had or they quickly learned Enlightenment-based values about the content of the new lives they were creating here in the United States. Such immigrants would be equal Americans in a universal public sphere. They would do business like others. They would work like others. They become citizens and vote like others. And they would be at home in America. And that's what they yearned for. While they remained or became Jews of whatever voluntary kind in the private sphere. Right? Not necessarily Orthodox Jews, but conservative Jews, Reform Jews, and even by the 20s and 30s, Reconstructionist Jews. It was a choice. Everything was a choice. Everything was voluntary. Most newcomers here were emancipated, not in Europe, especially if they came from Poland or Galicia or Russia. They became emancipated, means people with promise of equality before the law, simply by crossing the ocean and entering America. That was their great emancipation. And most came to envision an Enlightenment vision of equal individuals before the law in America. And as they transformed themselves over into Americans, they and their offspring learned to protest against any shortcomings they found in that society, short of the liberal idea. They built labor unions, they joined political parties to protest in electoral politics, and they took legal actions to make things fairer. Think about our own history here in Detroit. Think of the affront that Detroit Jews, the sons and daughters of immigrants in the 1920s and 30s, felt with Henry Ford's sponsorship of the Dearborn Independent and his blatant sponsorship of anti-Semitism. That was here. That was not what they hoped for, and they fought against it when they encountered it. Even as they became more American, though, they also became, at the same time, ethnic Americans, willing to fight as Jews. And they created Jewish voluntary communities and institutions with varieties of ways of expressing their Jewishness. That's our society. What about that distinctive society in Palestine? The early Israeli Jews, in founding a new society and state in the Middle East, nurtured a much more revolutionary and particularistic idea of making a new Jewish nation, state, and society in a Jewish homeland. They actually called it a Jewish Commonwealth in those years. They also believed they were making themselves over in the revolutionary process and creating among themselves what they called new Jews. Those pioneers had a collective sense that they could transform Jewish life and existence. They would answer the Jewish question that accompanied modernity by creating a society where Jews were a majority and, like all other peoples, could rule themselves as sovereigns in their own polity. And they would be free to work the land or work with their hands, free to make new cities or rural communities, and free collectively to join in the project of national upbuilding and restoration. But bottom line, this would be a Jewish nation with the same rights as all other nations to self-determination. It would also move and act on a Jewish calendar in accordance with the Jewish sense of time, the rhythm of the Jewish week, and it would reflect the needs of the Jewish nation, Jewish people being a nation, and would offer to those who pioneered or later settled or urbanized in it a new way of perfecting the form of being Jew or Jewish amidst modernity. To repeat, in the process, these revolutionaries would create a Jewish nation state and a society populated by new kinds of Jews. Whether socialists or revisionist Zionists or religious Zionists, all of whom differed sharply on what the content was of the new Jew, they nonetheless shared the idea of creating an awakened national community or collectivity, a nation for itself. What do these pictures tell you about the new Jew? The Jewish National Fund poster. What do they tell you? The Jew that works with his hands. Is that different from Jews elsewhere? A new Jew with new occupations, with new pursuits, right? Free to follow all pursuits that they want, normalizing against the backdrop of a Jewish history that had specialized Jews in certain money-handling activities. What else do these pictures tell you? Muscular Jews, strength, Jews with strength, Jews with muscles, the Jews that could roll up their sleeve, and what are they carrying? Carrying a rifle, and on your left, a plow, right? So Jews that could farm, Jews that could reconnect with the soil. Were most Jews in Europe connected with the soil? No. The truth is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, they had been barred from access to the land because they couldn't take Christian oaths. And that's why they went into these money pursuits. So this new nation state would not only create a new polity in Israel, which we recognize now we can go visit it on a mission, but it would create in that new state a new kind of Jew. Muscular, strong, able to defend, able to work the land, able to work with their hands, And it's quite easy to read. My students have a ball with these. They learn how to read images, which tell us a lot. To put this yet another way, Jews in Eretz Israel would find earthly salvation not through the general progress of society and the expansion of liberalism and enlightenment and the rise and achievement of new opportunities, not through the universalism of expanding equal rights, but rather by specific and particular Jewish initiative to create their own national homeland. People working with their arms and their shoulders to create something new. The Zionist idea, if you think about it, was and is actually a post-Enlightenment idea. It's not an idea simply about equality before the law. It's an idea rooted in the Romanticism and the national resurgence of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the aspirations for national independence that arose among the very many multiple minorities that coexisted in the Russian, Austrian, and German continental empires. Everybody had a national movement in those years. The Czechs wanted a Czechoslovakia and ultimately got one after World War I. Right? The Poles wanted a new nation. There had been no Poland between 1790s and 1917. The Poles got a new nation in 1917. The Ukrainians wanted a new nation but didn't get one. All the Eastern Europeans wanted a new nation. That nationalism emerges out of a slightly different context and out of a slightly different set of aspirations than the earlier Enlightenment ideas of a liberal Judaism. Ultimately, as I've mentioned, among Jews, there were varieties of the idea: socialist Zionism, revisionist Zionism, general Zionism, religious Zionism. But the central thrust, common to all, was building a Jewish nation state and society. Because of this Zionist orientation, the immigration from the great seedbed of global Jewish life, Eastern Europe, to America and to Israel, differed sharply in numbers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I've long been animated by the question, how do societies that bring in people from a relatively shared background, because Israel begins with Eastern Europeans, and our society, although we began with German Jews, largely is shaped by Eastern European Jews. Detroit certainly is. How can they build such different societies? Why do people come to build such different societies, although many of them share some common origins? I've learned over time that that's an erroneous assumption, because not only immigrant Jews came from Europe, they also came from the Maghreb and from the Middle Eastern nations. So it's much more complex, not so easy as I posed it. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Jews in Eastern Europe looked out at their range of opportunities, most Jews chose to go where? Unbelievably so. Jewish migration to America was 5 to 10 times larger than Jewish migration to Palestine before the late 1920s. It's really starkly shocking. The great Israeli historian Anita Shapira talks about immigration to Palestine as basically the foam atop the great wave of Jewish migrants leaving Eastern Europe, mostly heading to America. The Jewish population in America in 1877 was estimated at 229,000 individuals, mostly German Jews, Jews from the German Empire. Between 1882 and 1914, nearly 1.5 million Jews, as if in a giant windstorm, picked up and departed Eastern Europe and other areas of empire and came here, concentrating in American cities where opportunity was clustered. By 1907, the peak year of immigration during the Ellis Island years, the American Jewish population had expanded to 1.775 million from 229,000, increasing by 675% in 30 years. By 1917, the end of World War I, it was 3.338 million, nearly doubling in 10 years. And by 1927, and here we get into the generation of my parents, born in the 20s, just after the U.S. clapped the lid on the melting pot, passing restrictive immigration laws, the Jewish population here was 4.2 million Jews. In 1940, the American Jewish population was nearly 5 million. 5 million. Almost the size of the numbers of Jews who would die in Europe in the subsequent years. In 50 years, 1877 and 1927, the Jewish population in the United States increased by 1,750%, and Jews rose to become 3% of the expanding American population. There were other immigrants coming as well, but our percentage kept going up to 3%. For a more concrete idea, during the peak years of Jewish migration to the United States, Jewish net migration to America averaged about 86,000 annually. Right? That meant 860,000 in a decade. In the restricted 1920s, Jewish net migration fell to only 24,000 annually, and then fell further in the 1930s. In Palestine, initially under the Ottomans, the Jews numbered no more than about 24,000 in 1882. Very small population. At the end of World War I, when the Ottomans went away and the British Mandate began, there were 60,000 Jews in Palestine. Very small. Right? Think of that, 60,000 in all of Palestine. Think of how many Jews there were in New York already, or even here in Detroit. Talking about different scale of activities. At the end of the 1920s and 31, there were merely 174,000 Jews in Palestine. In 36, that number almost doubled to 384,000 Jews in Palestine. And in 1946, at the end of World War II, and before the post-war migration, there were 543,000. On the eve of nationhood, the Jewish community in Palestine was merely 20% of the size of the American Jewish community had been in 1927. That's how small it was. In the late 1940s, the Palestine Jewish community was 13% the size of Jewish America in the late 1940s. During the 20s, Jewish migration to Palestine during the third Aliyah and fourth Aliyah had averaged merely 10,000 annually. Talking about small numbers. I teach in a university that has 50,000 students. 50,000 students come to campus every day. Here we're talking about 10,000 immigrants coming annually to Palestine. During the refugee crisis of the 30s, Jewish immigration to Palestine rose to over 24,000 annually, and it began to overtake the American number, which fell below 20,000 annually. So the 20s is a crucial period in the growth of Palestine, because Jews who couldn't come here anymore after 1924, including members of my wife's family, went to Palestine if they could. And by the 1930s, Palestine displaces America as the primary destination of Jews fleeing Nazism in Europe in the 1930s, until the British White Paper in 1939 limits the flow. Between 1917 and 1940, under the Mandate, and including the increased immigration of the 30s, Jewish immigration to Palestine averaged, at this peak period, 14,000 annually. Talking small numbers. Until well after World War II, because it was more ideological and involved shifting to a lesser developed place where life was harder than the alternatives to be found in Detroit, in New York, in Chicago, and elsewhere, Jewish migration to Palestine was more selective, smaller, and more nationalist in content. The basic idea, to repeat, was that Jews coming to Palestine would not live as nationals of other nations. They would not find Zion elsewhere, not in New York, not in Detroit, not in Chicago. Instead, they would be nationals of their own created new nation. And such Zionists, if they were really Zionists, believed too in the negation or rejection of the diaspora. To go to Palestine was to reject the way of life before Palestine. And to make oneself over as a new Jew was to level an indictment about the old Jews, basically your parents. So we're talking about revolutionary in the most fundamental sense. Leading Zionist intellectuals demanded the recognition of the existence of a Jewish people and nation with a shared past, present, and future, which possessed intrinsic value and legitimacy, just like other peoples. They traced the genealogy of the Jewish people, drawing heavily from the Bible and the Jewish presence in Palestine during antiquity, and they focused on restoring that people to sovereignty in the land where Jews had once ruled. This idea, the yearning for the true Zion, I want to emphasize, was not the old religious yearning for redemption implicit in the annual Passover call about next year in Jerusalem. No relationship. Different. This was a different idea about taking modern history in their own hands and transforming their reality and location by group action, diplomacy, social innovation, and hard work. It wasn't about God. It was about men acting, men and women acting. And save for the religious Zionists, it had nothing to do with God and nothing to do with hastening the hoped for redemption that we know from our religious training. That is why the biggest enemies of migration to Palestine were who? The Orthodox Jews and the Orthodox rabbis who spoke out against migration to Palestine, told their charges to steer clear of it, and if they survived the war, opposed the state once it was created. I remember how shocked I was when I saw The Chosen for the first time. You know that movie? And here were Orthodox Jews, I grew up as a conservative Jew, opposing the state of Israel in 1948 and arguing about it. And I said, what? But that was the truth. Fourth, whatever was intended by the early Zionist pioneers and the revolutionary creators of the Jewish state, which declared independence in 48 and created a modern society and economy of a certain kind, has in the years since 48 been superseded or slowly swept aside by the effects of large-scale waves of migration that came after, from the 50s and 60s on, creating a remarkably diverse Israeli society, and also by the gradual transformation of the economy from what was once a state-run social economy into a private economy integrated with a globalizing world. Here the point to be made is that revolutions and revolutionaries are unyielding in seeking certain goals and objectives, but their revolutionary creations, once initiated, live on in the real world, and they have to change with the processes that are affecting them. Think of what's going on in Cuba right now as a perfect example. So, similarly, Israel had to change from the 48 on. Many of the newcomers to New Israel who came after the war and the Holocaust came without nationalist idealism or Zionist commitment, seeking merely safe haven or refuge. And many came with them, if they came from the Middle East, with traditional views and modes of being Jewish, not wanting to be new Jews. These newcomers, and the way the state placed many of them spatially in Israel, created new blocks of Israelis, who were often disaffected Israelis, angry Israelis, whose differences in background, culture, and social status were registered in and magnified by the opportunities for representing difference in the parliamentary and multi-party system Israel had adopted from the British, and also by their existence on the margins of Israeli economy. Those who built the state 1918 to 48, taking advantage of the Balfour Declaration and of British rule, and carrying out an evolutionary strategy against the British, ruled independent Israel from 48 on in what was a state-centered, Ashkenazi, Jewish-dominated enterprise, mostly centered in the powerful Israeli Labor Party and the Histadrut, the General Labor Union of Israel. But these core Israelis, the pioneers and their offspring, the people who had tried to make themselves into new Jews, were ultimately in the 1970s unseated by those who, unlike them, represented or spoke for the Mizrahim, newcomers and their descendants, who had been initially marginalized and sought their place now in a changing Israel in the late 20th century. Early development in Israel had also been directed under distinctively socialist centralized state control. Think about it, tasked with absorbing immigrants, settling remote areas, training the unskilled, building basic water transport and electrical infrastructures, and providing health and human services and housing to a fast-growing population, the centrally directed economy permitted Israel to develop at an accelerated pace. Israel became a model for other developing nations. The centralized economy carried with it, however, enormous frictions between the bureaucrats that ran it and the citizens who were pushed around and served by it. But it did get things done, and among developing nations, Israel was an advancing developing nation. And by the 60s was exporting new techniques and methods to other developing nations. In an arid land where water was scarce and rainfall was even unevenly spread throughout the country, a lot of it in the north and very little of it in the south, Israel actually undertook a massive national building project to move water via a giant aqueduct from the heavy rainfall north to the arid low rainfall south. Not many of us know about this, but such a centralized, powerful national undertaking is much less conceivable today. The new governments that came to power in 78, after the political change in Israel, instituted new policies and pushed along a sharply new orientation to private market-oriented development. Government diminished its extensive role in the private economy and in capital markets. It increased the positive climate for investment. It drew in extensive amounts of venture capital from abroad. It absorbed the newest immigrants from the former Soviet Union who brought higher education and technical and engineering skills. It tapped into the universities and research centers as centers for promoting development and expanded higher education throughout the country. Israel also helped the privatization process along by using well-designed incubator policies and subsidies for economic development. As a consequence, a lot of entrepreneurial burst forth in the newer Israel. And you probably know this new Israel, which is different than the old Israel. This is the start of the startup nation, which didn't exist before, but now exists in the late 20th century and early 21st century, a phenomenon involving remarkable levels of innovation and development. The gap in living standards compared to income levels in developed Western nations was narrowed remarkably. Israel has the per capita income of a Portugal or Italy and many other European nations. On the other hand, the gap in the inequality among Israelis widened. And we see that in some of the issues that are currently before Israel. Housing crisis, growing poverty, and other problems of inequality. Inequality is worsened as a whole, and a model socialist society with minimal equality shifted to a wealthier, more productive society and startup nation, but with diminished mutual responsibility. When we watch demonstrations in Israel on our televisions, we're seeing the consequences of that inequality. A fifth thing that was and is distinctive about Israel is that it's, as its founders envisioned it, Israel is a Jewish nation. Indeed, it is the only Jewish nation, the one and only. We in America are a voluntary community. Our brethren in Israel are part of a Jewish nation state. The national flag shows a Jewish star. The annual and weekly calendar moves in accord with the Jewish lunar calendar. National holidays include all major Jewish religious holidays. National monuments under jurisdiction of the state include religious spaces like the Kotel, the Western Wall, and also state spaces prominent in the narrative of the Jews, like the Fortress Masada. The Holocaust Memorial Museum, that is Yad Vashem, is a state institution mandated by Israeli law, connecting Israel with the story of the Jewish people in Europe. Archaeology, meaning deepening knowledge of the Jewish presence in the land, is a state-supported undertaking. Creating Yad Vashem and promoting archaeology is part of the Jewish state's effort to absorb and identify with the history of the Jewish people, both ancient and modern. So in those ways, Israel is a Jewish state. But when we say Israel is a Jewish nation, let us understand what this means and what it may not mean. Right? We can pursue some questions and discussion on this later. Being a Jewish nation does not mean it is a halakhic state tied to Judaism, where the state promotes Judaism, mandates kashrut, and polices Sabbath observance. That is not Israel. In this sense, Israel is something less than a Judaic state while being a Jewish state. And it is certainly not, as some of Israel's enemies often charge, a Jewish theocracy. While Israel is a Jewish nation state, it is also a democratic state, promising equality before the law to minorities and recognizing the rights of all religions to operate within the boundaries of Israel. Now, due to a decision, a historical decision made in 1947, just before statehood, some control of certain aspects of society were ceded by the original founding Zionist leadership to the religious leadership in what became Israel. And contemporary Israelis live as a consequence and must manage the results with that bargain. In Israel, marriage, divorce, and burial, matters of personal circumstances, personhood, are under rabbinical control. So there is hence no civil marriage. There was a bill passed in 2010 allowing civil marriage for those who register as not belonging to any religion, but there are very few such people in Israel. And under religious direction, there is no possibility of interfaith marriage. The Reform and the conservative movements are making some inroads, but basically, matters of personhood are controlled by the Orthodox rabbinical establishment. In Israel, also, full-time yeshiva students continue to have a deferral from military service so that they can study Torah. Probably one of the most divisive issues in a society divided between secular and religious Jews. Divisions and frictions on these issues repeatedly rile Israel. For the most part, however, beyond these matters, ultra-religious Jews who have their own parties in parliament act not to change the status quo, but as interest groups making sure that they get a share of the jobs and benefits that come from the state. As a Jewish state, Israel functions much like traditionally pluralist Middle Eastern nations, with a state religion and more or less autonomous minorities. Israel makes no effort to assimilate and transform minorities, or even to create uniformity among the Jewish majority. Each religious community controls matters of personal status, and each religious community practices cultural, religious, and even judicial autonomy. Religious authorities in every community control marriage, divorce, and burial. Also, as a pluralist society, and this is a way in which Israel differs from American Jewry, there are multiple functioning school systems under state support, at least 5. There's a state secular system, there's a state religious system for the modern Orthodox, there's a state Haredi system for the ultra-Orthodox, There's a Shas system for the Mizrahi Jews, and there's an Arab system, all under state support, right? No effort to make a common curriculum or share a common learning among the next generation, but actually a celebration and a tolerance of great pluralism. Finally, we're coming to an end, and I'll stop with this last point. The independent national state and society of the Jews has been consistently opposed by Arabs in Palestine and by all the surrounding Arab states. To understand Israel, one must comprehend its delimited size and its continuity as a place of persistent conflict, persistent violent conflict. I have had the opportunity, I don't know if it's an opportunity, I've had the experience several times to be with Israeli parents when they took their sons to the army, in one case a daughter. That is a common experience in Israel. Israel was created in a rough neighborhood, as many people say, and it has been in low-level conflict or else outright war nearly continuously with the Arabs and most Arab neighbors for almost 90 years. Think about that. With the exception since the late 70s of Egypt and more recently Jordan. While the Jews were initially building the Jewish national home in the pioneer years, the Arabs revolted against the Jewish presence and began forming a budding national movement. And in the 1920s and 30s, Arab national aspirations actually grew faster than the rate of Jewish migration. The Arabs uniformly opposed early discussions of splitting up the land and partition. And Arab movements and gangs sowed terror throughout the land during the late 20s and mid-30s during the Arab Revolt, which the British put down harshly. The Arabs also opposed partition in 1947 after the British abandoned the mandate and threw decision-making to the United Nations. And when the UN voted for partition, the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state in 1947, Arab irregulars, Palestinian villagers, and an Arab liberation army armed by the British fought against independence in early 1948, even before independence was formally declared. And then 5 national Arab armies after mid-1948 contested the existence of the new Jewish state during the War of Independence from 1948 to mid-1949. The Nakba, the creation of Palestinian refugee population, and the persistent recalcitrance of the Palestinians who believe in the myth of a right of return continues to this day. More wars followed. I mean, it's just amazing to review this litany. In 56, 67, and 73, and again in 1982. And Israel has also had to mount lesser forms of war, what it calls operations, in 2002, 6, 9, 12, and 14. Even this list understates the reality because it omits retribution operations by the military in the 1950s and the war of attrition that followed the 67 Six-Day War. In such a society that's constantly under outside pressure and needing to project and use power to defend itself, one consequence has been that the military has become a central institution in the Jewish state. Charged with protecting the nation and creating a deterrent, whether through conventional warfare or low-intensity conflict and special operations, and defense against asymmetric assaults. The military also has taken on the added task in such a pluralist society of molding one nation from its disparate peoples and its multiple school systems, integrating people from different Israeli subcommunities, including Jews, but also Druze, Christian, and Bedouin, into one people. Few Israel leaders can come to power without having served prominently in the Israeli Defense Forces. Think how different that is than our society. And the military in Israel in the late 20th century has also become a center of Israeli innovation, and economic development, and a lot of economic development is spin-offs off of the technological advances made in armored personnel carriers, vehicle protection systems, missiles, weapon systems, Iron Dome, and laser defense. It's remarkable. So to summarize, this is what's distinctive about Israel. It's a distinctive homeland, different from all others. It's an immigrant nation shaped by waves of diverse newcomers and continues to be up to the present. It is a nation rooted in a nationalist idea and a particularist commitment, even though the immigrants come less with that commitment to begin with now. It's a nation that has changed from its early leadership to new leadership, and from a socialist state-directed economy to a private market-oriented economy. It's a Jewish nation, but not a halakhic Jewish or Judaic nation. And it's a country in which the military plays a powerful central role, defending and embattled people, preparing leaders, molding national unity, and of late, in an increasingly technological world, helping spur economic development. Let me end there. I can get to some of these other points in discussion. That's how I see Israel as distinctive. The product of a distinctive history, the product of a distinctive idea, the product of a distinctive predicament, living in a tough neighborhood where everyone is your enemies, and the product of a distinctive bargain struck about what a Jewish nation that also has democratic values should be. For those of you who are going there shortly with the mission, I wish you safe travel and a great time. Questions? Jeff?
When my grandparents came over and returned the last century, typically among Jews from all nations, German, Italian, Polish, the first thing that the new immigrants wanted to do was to learn and become assimilated to America. I see less of that. I see more people coming from other countries that want to remain among their own, their own language. What's the situation there?
Again, this is a distinctive history. Hebrew was not the language of Israel to begin with. It had to be created. And then it had to be taught and learned. So Hebrew as a modern language and the reconstitution of it as the primary language of Israel took a full generation or two. And at that very moment, when it was becoming the dominant language of the Yeshuv, which became Israel, then these new waves of immigrants started coming in. And the new waves in the early 50s were larger than the core society that was supposed to absorb them. And so Hebrew, again, did not become fully effectively the language of everybody. But over time, when a language institutes itself and is used in the institutions and as the language of the army, more and more people learn Hebrew. And I think it's a situation now where Hebrew is the active language of all communities, even though in many communities they continue to speak a different language. So people from North Africa and from Yemen often speak Arabic. The Russians speak Russian. And now the signs in Israel are in Russian as well as Hebrew, Arabic, and English. The Russians have their own television station. So in a pluralist nation, it's possible to live separately without Hebrew. I know many American Jews who've gone in the 1970s and continued to live in Israel, but never learned Hebrew. They speak English to their fellows. The Russians speak Russians on the television, and that continues. But the core institutions, Israeli television, Israeli films, is Hebrew, and that's becoming more predominant. And military especially. And we saw This past summer, the Americans who go as fighters in the IDF, they have to learn Hebrew. Otherwise, they can't function. So just as if you want to get ahead in America, you have to learn English, and most immigrants do, and most immigrants in the second generation do not continue their parents' languages. So in Israel, the first generation may remain apart, but the second generation that goes into the army, that goes to the universities, and that seeks to go into those avenues of opportunity that are open, they learn Hebrew, and probably also English.
How did Israel become a nation of scientific development and advancement? Who was the instigator to light this fire in this country?
I don't know the full story here, but it's an excellent question, and the answer needs to be developed. There's no book on the subject. Israel committed early, during the period of the Yishuv, to building universities. Hebrew University was founded in 1925. It wanted to have a world-class university where scientific research would be carried out. So there was state sponsorship of it from the very beginning. The Weizmann Institute, I forget when it was founded, but it was founded during this period before independence. The German immigration that picked up in the 30s from fleeing from the Nazis brought with it, just as it did to the United States, many university-trained scientists, engineers, and so forth. So I think right away from the beginning, as a confluence of immigration, as a confluence of state support, and of commitment to science, the state was sponsoring scientific development. That's continued to the present. Science is part of the national defense effort. One of my best friends is married to one of the guys who works on lasers that was part of the Iron Dome project. He gets state grants working in Tel Aviv University. And now, with the Russian immigration, you've had a second infusion from migration of highly skilled technicians, engineers, and so forth. So I think that's part of it. I think also the books I've read and talked with people about, there's a cultural connection to this. There's an Israeli emphasis on ad hoc innovation. It can drive you crazy sometimes. They wait until the last minute, and then they ad hoc innovate a solution to whatever the question or problem is. But that's a cultural trait which I believe is widespread in the society, along with arrogance, inability to wait on a bus line, and a number of other traits. But it serves them very well in innovating new businesses, new technical developments. What Israel's doing now in the development of medical technology, including technology that goes inside your body and works around in the bloodstream, it's just amazing. It's just fantastic. If a cure comes for cancer, I know where it's going to come from. It's not coming from this society. It's going to come from Israel. So there's a separate story there that should be told. I think I've only got it vaguely right, but it's a great question.
Just a quick question. I wish I knew more of the history, but after the Holocaust, when Jews were free to leave Europe, I thought from 46 to 48, by mere numbers, was only 100,000 additional. What am I missing?
Israel remained under the British mandate. The British's only interest, although the British had been behind the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the British moved away from that declaration in the 30s and 40s. It reneged. I have fights with my English historian colleagues on this all the time. And as a consequence, it viewed Palestine merely as part of the context of protecting the Suez Canal, which was the lifeline of empire to India. So what they were interested in Palestine was not bringing in new Jews, but in protecting the harmony and peace of that area, which was closely located to the Suez Canal. So the British controlled immigration even after 1945, when British and American soldiers found all these survivors in the camps. Survivors were left in DP camps for years and years and years, and if they tried illegally to break the British blockade, they were arrested and put on Cyprus, right? Including many young people. And it's one of the most stirring episodes in Israeli history, the effort directed by the Mossad to do the Aliyah Bet, the illegal immigration from Europe, to break the blockade and bring in people illegally to become Israelis. More people should know about that. But the British, until the British left, control of immigration was in somebody else's hands. In 1948, if you have an independent state, what do you get control of? Immigration. And so immigration rose from 1948 on. That state developed the right of return, and all Jews then could come, regardless of the circumstance. That doesn't mean that Israelis welcomed Holocaust survivors. Israelis were very bad in terms of recognizing what Holocaust survivors had gone through. And many Holocaust survivors' children in school had the experience of being bullied by other people and called soap. Were you growing up in the 50s and 60s? Okay, that's a little bit later. It was worse than that. It was worse than that. You grew up post-Eichmann trial. And the Eichmann trial was the first time that survivors came out publicly and gave testimony, and things began to change from that point on. But if you were a kid in the 50s, born in the DP camps and going to school in Israel in the 50s, you had a rough time. And there are many memoirs that detail that. Please. You can ask me, but historians would tell you that's not the role of the historian.
Well, I'm going to give you the chance anyway.
We can tell you about the past, but we can't predict the future.
The shared experience of the Israeli narrative is a struggle. Not that I think there's peace on the horizon anytime soon. But if peace comes about, can Israel survive itself? Say 2 generations post.
A friend of mine comes from Hebrew University to teach in James Madison College. We bring him almost every year. And he begins with the Zionist idea and the creation of a unified, envisioned society. And then he adds all the multiple Israeli voices from there on and deals with the policy issues that emerge out of the conflicts among all those voices. So that's basically your question. Given all that diversity, divisions between secular and religious, between new immigrants and more recent immigrants, divisions between people who have one view on the peace process, another view on the peace process. Can Israel survive itself? And the question is, who knows? Sometimes I think that the secular and religious parts of Israel will be at loggerheads. And yet, conflicts and issues seem to be remediated without, battle, without barricades. I know from living in Israel for periods of time that when the religious move into a secular neighborhood, it's very much the same kind of reaction as you have here in some pretty prejudiced neighborhoods when African Americans and Mexicans move in. They feel that the neighborhood's going to hell. And so there's real conflict between secular and religious. And when they find that they're paying taxes and sending their sons to the army, and the ultra-Orthodox are collecting money from the state and being excused from service in the army, there's real ongoing conflict. So Israel is not a harmonious society in the fullest sense. It's a conflict-ridden society. But somehow it seems to move along. One of the things I was going to say if I had more time was the political system also doesn't work to harmonize things. The political system magnifies the conflict. Multiple parties means that everybody can have a party, right? You guys on this side of the room want a party, you can have a party. Just score enough votes. You want to have a party, you can have a party that opposes their party, right? And then the government, which is a parliamentary system, they have to bargain to create a coalition of all these multiple parties. And it's hard to create, and then it's hard to keep together once it's created. So governments rise and they fall. That's a formula for instability. And that's the way the Israeli system works. So it's very difficult to govern. It's very difficult to innovate. It's very difficult to harmonize. And yet somehow it holds together, perhaps because of the security issue, everybody's in the same boat, and perhaps because of the vision of a Jewish society, which is still pretty strong among some people. That's the best I can do.
We're going to have to end right there. And I want to thank Professor for this amazing, I think, really interesting analysis. Those of you who are staying for the meeting, stay here. But Professor Walter has agreed to, there are wonderful cookies and coffee, really, really good-looking cookies and coffee out there. So the conversation does not have to end. Just one more time, thank you so much, Professor, for this wonderful. Okay?